In 1875, Princess Louise was sold off like a piece of property. Brutally abused, stripped of her wealth, and locked in an asylum, she fought back. Her spectacular armed escape exposed the corrupt elite, turning a ruthless transaction into the marriage that doomed the German house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The world she was born into in 1858 was not a place of fairy tale castles and benevolent rulers. Her father, King Leopold II of Belgium, was a man who operated a massive African territory as his own private, brutal corporation. He amassed a staggering personal fortune built on the severe exploitation of the Congo Free State, viewing human life purely as capital. This ruthless pragmatism extended to his own family. In Leopold's eyes, his daughters were never meant to be loved or protected. They were highly valuable assets, raised specifically to be sold off in strategic marriages to secure geopolitical power and expand his influence across Europe. Louise was essentially put on the auction block when she was just a teenager. The buyer who claimed her was Prince Philip of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was 14 years older than her, a cold and calculating man who hid his predatory nature behind a barrage of aristocratic titles. Philip did not look at the young princess and see a partner. He saw a direct, unquestionable pipeline to her father's unimaginable wealth. Their union was entirely transactional. It was a hostile corporate merger disguised under the heavy silk and grand traditions of a royal 19th century wedding. The reality of this transaction became horrifyingly clear in 1875, when 17-year-old Louise was forced into her new life at the Palace of Laeken. The wedding night immediately deteriorated into a severe psychological and physical trauma. Terrified by the sudden and brutal aggression of a man she barely knew, the young princess fled her own bridal chamber. She ran barefoot into the sprawling dark palace greenhouses, shivering in the freezing night air in nothing but a thin nightgown. She wept uncontrollably in the shadows until palace guards inevitably tracked her down and dragged her back inside. There was no escape for her. For the next 2 decades, Louise lived as a high-profile prisoner. Philippe was a severe alcoholic with a documented affinity for sadism and control. Behind the heavy gilded doors of their estate, he systematically dismantled her sense of self. He possessed a vast collection of explicit materials from across the continent and forced his young wife to view and submit to his violent, degrading fantasies. When his constant drinking fueled his rage, he used his fists and his riding crop to ensure her complete submission. She documented this living nightmare with chilling clarity in her later writings. She stated plainly that she felt as though she was chained to a wild boar. She bore him 2 children during these agonizing decades, but she was never treated as a mother or a wife. She was a captive who had to smile for the public while enduring constant hidden violence. The light in her eyes was systematically extinguished by 20 years of relentless abuse, leaving behind a woman who seemed completely broken by the royal system. By 1895, 37-year-old Louise had lived more than half her life in quiet agony. It was then that Jeza Matačić walked into her world. He was a lieutenant in the Croatian cavalry, 10 years her junior, possessing no vast fortune and no grand aristocratic titles. He had absolutely no political power to offer a royal family. What he did have was an absolute unwavering devotion to a woman the rest of the world had ignored or exploited. He saw the bruises she desperately tried to hide under her heavy dresses, and he offered her a genuine, dangerous lifeline. He told her without hesitation that he was willing to die to wipe those bruises away. Their subsequent affair abandoned any pretense of quiet, discreet indiscretion. It ignited as an explosive, desperate grab at survival by two people who knew they were standing on a powder keg. They loved each other with a reckless abandon, defying the strict social codes of their era. For the first time in her life, Louise experienced physical affection that was not tied to pain, obligation, or financial transaction. When Prince Philip inevitably discovered the affair, his fragile narcissistic ego demanded immediate blood. He could not accept that his property had rebelled. He challenged Gotha to a duel, fully intending to kill the cavalryman and force his terrified wife back into submission. To maximize the psychological torture, Philip scheduled this deadly confrontation on Louise's 40th birthday in 1898. They met in the morning mist, drawing their pistols as the ultimate consequence of Louise's bid for freedom loomed over them. The shots rang out, but the tyrant missed his mark. Gotha, a highly trained military marksman, fired true and shattered Philip's hand. The cavalryman could have easily put a bullet through the prince's head, ending the abuse permanently, but he chose to spare his life. Philip fell to his knees in the dirt, publicly humiliated, bleeding, and utterly defeated. The aftermath of the duel didn't bring the swift justice or liberation Louise had desperately hoped for. Instead, it plunged her into a meticulously orchestrated legal and medical nightmare. Prince Philip, nursing a shattered hand and a completely decimated ego, realized that a public divorce would strip him of his proximity to King Leopold's immense fortune. He needed a method to permanently neutralize his wife without forfeiting his financial claims. In the aristocratic circles of the late 19th century, psychiatry was rapidly emerging not just as a medical field, but as a highly effective tool for social control. It was an era where male authority was absolute, and any woman who defied her husband, expressed independent sexual desires, or demanded financial autonomy could easily be pathologized. Philippe leveraged his immense wealth and political connections to gather a cabal of compliant royal physicians. They did not need to examine Louise thoroughly. The diagnosis was predetermined by the highest bidder. They officially labeled her with conditions like nymphomania and severe moral insanity. These were convenient catch-all terms frequently used to incarcerate inconvenient upper-class women. By pathologizing her affair with Gotha and her desperate attempts to secure her own money for an escape, the medical establishment provided Philip with the ultimate weapon. He bypassed the courts and the messy public scandals of a divorce trial. With the stroke of a pen by a few corrupt doctors, Louise was legally stripped of her personhood. She was no longer a royal princess, a mother, or even a citizen with basic legal rights. She was officially classified as a ward of the state, entirely under the control of the very man who had tormented her for 2 decades. King Leopold II, her own father, was complicit in this ultimate betrayal. A man who viewed human beings as expendable resources in his brutal colonization of the Congo, Leopold had no paternal affection for a daughter who brought public embarrassment to the Belgian crown. When Philippe presented the plan to have Louise committed, Leopold not only agreed but actively supported the maneuver to ensure the family's financial assets remained tightly controlled. He officially sanctioned her removal from society, turning a blind eye to the reality of the medical black site she was being sent to. The transition from the gilded halls of a royal palace to the sterile, terrifying environment of the Lindenhof Sanatorium was brutally sudden. She was abducted from her daily life, separated permanently from her children, and transported under heavy guard to the facility in Saxony. The sanatorium was designed to house the severely mentally ill, and placing a completely sane woman in such an environment was a calculated form of psychological torture. She was forced out of her silk dresses and into the coarse, humiliating uniform of a psychiatric patient. The heavy iron doors locked behind her, sealing her inside a world where logic, truth, and basic human dignity held absolutely no value. Her daily existence became a grueling battle to maintain her grip on reality. She was surrounded by patients suffering from profound, untreated psychiatric conditions. The constant background noise of her life was the sound of manic laughter, sudden screams, and the chaotic violence of the genuinely insane. She was confined to a small, stark room, deprived of personal belongings, books, or any connection to the outside world. The physicians at Lindenhof were fully aware of her true mental state, yet they participated in the charade, subjecting her to harsh treatments designed to break her will. The medical establishment of the era operated with a frightening lack of oversight. The physicians at Lindenhof were pioneers in a dark branch of psychiatry that specialized in the containment of difficult women. They utilized a pseudoscientific framework to justify their cruelest methods. Louise was subjected to endless interrogations designed to confuse and disorient her. The doctors would twist her entirely rational anger into symptoms of mania. When she raised her voice in frustration, they documented it as a psychotic episode. When she wept for the children she was forbidden to see, they labeled it a depressive collapse. Her very human responses to an inhuman situation were systematically cataloged as evidence of her incurable lunacy. She learned very quickly that showing any emotion was a trap. She adopted a stony, impenetrable exterior. She forced herself to maintain a rigid daily routine within the confines of her small cell, keeping her mind sharp by reciting literature, doing complex mental mathematics, and recalling the specific details of her life before the asylum. She grasped that she was engaged in a war of attrition. The doctors wanted her to break, to genuinely lose her grip on reality so that their diagnosis would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. She refused to give them that satisfaction. They frequently threatened her with early forms of electroshock therapy, cold water restraints, and permanent isolation. This systematic medical torture served a singular purpose: aggressive financial extortion. The doctors, acting as well-paid proxies for Prince Philip, presented her with a relentless ultimatum. They promised that the iron doors would open, the screaming would stop, and she could walk free the moment she signed the legal documents transferring her entire fortune and future inheritance to her husband. It was a simple, brutal transaction, but they severely misjudged the core of her character. Despite the freezing nights, the constant fear, and the profound isolation, Louise refused to sign. Every day she woke up in the asylum was a conscious choice to endure hell rather than surrender to the monster who had put her there. She found a deep hidden reservoir of defiance within herself. She clung to the memory of Gotha, using her love for him as an anchor to keep her mind sharp and grounded. She knew that signing the papers would validate the false narrative of her madness and give Philip complete victory. She chose the coarse patient's gown over submission. Meanwhile, the financial machinery of her imprisonment churned on. Prince Philip appointed a series of aggressive lawyers to officially manage her estate. They began liquidating her personal assets, selling off her jewelry, her private properties, and her investments to fund his lavish lifestyle and cover his massive gambling debts. They were steadily draining the very resources she would need to survive if she ever managed to escape. King Leopold II watched this financial cannibalism with quiet approval. He was satisfied that the scandal had been contained and that the wealth remained firmly within the grasp of the established aristocracy, even if it meant his daughter was rotting in a cell. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating weapon used against her. She was denied all incoming and outgoing mail. Any letters she desperately tried to smuggle out to sympathetic friends or to Gotha were intercepted by the asylum staff and handed directly to Philippe's lawyers as further proof of her delusional fixations. She was effectively a ghost, a woman erased from the world of the living. Yet rumors of her true condition began to slowly circulate through the underground networks of European servants and low-ranking officials who witnessed the blatant corruption of her incarceration. While Louise fought a silent daily war for her sanity in Saxony, Gotha was enduring his own orchestrated hell. Prince Philippe had ensured that the cavalry officer was completely ruined. Using his vast network of political influence, Philippe had Gotha framed for financial crimes, specifically the forgery of promissory notes. In a military court heavily biased by aristocratic pressure, Gotha stood no chance. He was stripped of his rank, his honor, and his freedom. He was sentenced to 4 years in a harsh military prison, explicitly designed to break the spirits of disgraced soldiers. For 4 years, the two lovers were completely isolated from each other, both locked in different kinds of prisons, enduring punishment solely because they dared to challenge a corrupt royal marriage. Philippe believed that 4 years of hard labor and military discipline would crush the young Croatian officer, forcing him to forget the Belgian princess. But the harsh conditions of the military prison only hardened Gotha's resolve. He spent his sentence meticulously plotting his next move, turning his despair into a cold, calculated focus. These whispers of her survival eventually reached Gotha during his agonizing years in military prison. The brutal conditions of his confinement were designed to break him, but the faint rumors that Louise was still alive, still resisting, fueled his survival. He endured the hard labor, the meager rations, and the constant humiliation from guards who took pleasure in tormenting a fallen officer. He focused his mind entirely on the physical and mental conditioning required for what he knew he had to do upon his release. He trained his body relentlessly, turning his prison sentence into a brutal preparation camp for the mission ahead. When the prison doors finally opened for Gotha in 1902, he walked out into a world that had completely rejected him. He had no money, no title, no reputation, and no immediate prospects. He was a disgraced former officer carrying the heavy stigma of a criminal conviction. Most men would have accepted their defeat, perhaps fleeing to America to start a new life under a different name. But Gotha did not hesitate. His singular, consuming objective was to find Louise and tear her out of whatever medical fortress Philip had buried her in. The task before him was monumental. The exact location of Louise's confinement was a closely guarded state secret, protected by the combined power of the Belgian, Austrian, and German royal establishments. Gotha had to operate entirely in the shadows. He spent months taking on menial jobs, saving every meager coin he earned to fund his private investigation. He tracked down former servants, bribed low-level hospital clerks, and followed faint trails of medical transfers across European borders. He slept in cheap boarding houses and often went hungry, funneling all his resources into the search. He began his covert investigation in Vienna, navigating the dangerous underworld of disgraced officials and professional informants. He possessed a soldier's discipline and a desperate man's lack of fear. He systematically tracked down the medical bureaucrats who had signed Louise's commitment papers. He did not ask them questions. He aggressively interrogated them in dark alleys and secluded taverns, using the threat of physical violence to extract the pieces of the puzzle. He learned how the bribes had been distributed, who held the keys, and the exact protocols used to transfer high-profile royal wards. His pursuit of the truth was a solitary, dangerous crusade. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that Prince Philip's spies were likely still monitoring him. He assumed false identities, traveling in the third-class carriages of trains, sleeping in the dirt when necessary, and communicating with his small network of allies through heavily coded messages. He was a man completely consumed by a singular purpose. The world had told him that Louise was a mad woman and that he was a criminal, but he operated with the absolute moral clarity of a man who knew he was fighting a deeply evil system. It took him nearly 2 years of relentless, agonizing detective work to finally penetrate the veil of secrecy. A bribed official eventually slipped him the name, the Lindenhof Sanatorium in Saxony. Knowing the location was only the first impossible step. Getting her out required a plan that bordered on suicidal. Lindenhof was not a porous hospital, it was a fortress, heavily guarded and strictly monitored to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. Giza knew he could not simply walk in and demand her release through legal channels. He was a convicted felon, and she was a certified lunatic. The intelligence he gathered pointed definitively to the massive structure located in a remote, heavily wooded region of Saxony. The geographical isolation was intentional, designed to prevent escape and to keep the screams of the patients far away from polite society. The walls were high, the gates were forged from heavy iron, and the grounds were patrolled by guards who operated more like a private militia than hospital orderlies. Giza spent 3 freezing weeks camped in the dense forest overlooking the facility, observing every movement with a stolen military spyglass. He mapped the entire complex, noting the blind spots in the guards' patrol routes and identifying the specific wing where the high-security wards were located. He watched the deliveries of food and medical supplies, calculating the precise moments when the heavy gates were briefly unlocked. He noted the times when the senior physicians left the premises and when the night shift took over. He was gathering the critical intelligence required to execute a flawless surgical strike. There would be no margin for error. A failed attempt would result in his immediate death and guarantee that Louise would be moved to an even darker, more impenetrable facility. He realized that the only way to free her was through overwhelming coordinated force. He began to reach out to a small, trusted circle of former military comrades and individuals who harbored deep resentment against the unchecked power of the royal elite. He built a covert strike team, carefully selecting men who understood the extreme risks involved. If they were caught, they would not just be arrested. They would likely face execution or permanent imprisonment for assaulting a state medical facility and kidnapping a royal ward. The strike team he assembled was small but fiercely loyal. They were not mercenaries. They were men who had served with him, men who respected his honor and hated the corrupt aristocratic system that had ruined him. They understood that stripped of any legal sanction, this extraction was an act of violent, total rebellion. They armed themselves heavily, prepared to use lethal force if necessary to secure her freedom. They synchronized their pocket watches in the dark forest, checking their revolvers and adjusting their dark clothing. They spent weeks studying the layout of Lindenhof. They monitored the shift changes of the guards, the routines of the medical staff, and the structural vulnerabilities of the main gates. Geza secured a fast carriage and the strongest horses he could find, stashing them in a dense forest just a few miles from the sanatorium walls. He acquired firearms, not with the intention to kill, but to provide the necessary shock and awe to paralyze the facility's defenses. Every detail of the extraction was planned with the precise, cold logic of a military operation. The night of the breakout, in 1904, was thick with low-hanging clouds and a sharp, biting wind. Geza and his men moved through the darkness with absolute silence, cutting the telegraph wires connecting Lindenhof to the local constabulary. They eliminated the facility's ability to call for immediate reinforcements. They approached the rear entrances, bypassing the main gate entirely. Using a combination of brute force and stolen keys, they breached the outer perimeter and entered the terrifying, echoing hallways of the asylum. The execution of the raid was a masterpiece of organized violence. They moved through the freezing night with terrifying speed and precision. The guards stationed at the rear entrance never had a chance to raise the alarm. They were neutralized quickly and silently, dragged into the shadows before they could draw their weapons. The strike team moved methodically through the echoing, dimly lit corridors, their heavy boots making no sound on the stone floors. They reached the high-security ward, confronting the reinforced iron door that separated Louise from the world. The heavy locks were smashed with specialized tools, the metallic clanging echoing loudly down the empty halls. The noise finally alerted the night staff. Shouts rang out, and the sound of heavy boots running toward their position signaled that their narrow window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Geza kicked the door open, stepping into the stark, freezing room where the woman he loved had been buried alive for 7 years. The iron door smashed open, hitting the stone wall with a deafening crack. Inside the freezing cell, Louise huddled in the corner. She wore a thin, filthy patient's gown. 7 years of institutional abuse had stripped away her royal weight and health, leaving her gaunt and trembling. But her eyes remained sharp. She looked up, expecting to see a sadistic doctor with a syringe or a guard with a baton. Instead, standing in the doorway, breathing heavily and holding a drawn revolver, was Geza. It had been nearly a decade since she last saw his face. He did not waste time with dramatic speeches. The asylum was waking up around them. Alarms began to ring, a harsh mechanical screaming that tore through the quiet forest. Geza rushed across the cell, pulled a heavy wool coat from his satchel, and wrapped it around her frail shoulders. He lifted her to her feet, his grip firm and urgent. He told her they had exactly 2 minutes to reach the outer perimeter before the main guard detachment sealed the building. She did not hesitate. She gripped his arm, stepping out of the cell that had been her entire world for 7 long years. The hallway was a scene of controlled chaos. The strike team had secured the immediate corridor, but heavy footsteps echoed from the stairwell. 2 asylum guards rushed around the corner, carrying heavy wooden clubs. Geza did not pause. He raised his revolver and fired a warning shot directly into the stone ceiling. The deafening blast in the enclosed space shattered the remaining windows and forced the guards to the floor. The team moved rapidly over them, dragging Louise through the maze of sterile white corridors. Patients in the adjacent wards began to scream, triggered by the gunshot and the sudden violence. The sound was a terrifying wave of human misery, but Louise blocked it out. She focused entirely on the broad back of the man pulling her forward. They reached the breached rear entrance just as the facility's armed security detail arrived at the opposite end of the hall. Gunfire erupted. Bullets chipped the stone walls, sending sharp fragments of rock flying into the air. Gotha pushed Louise behind a heavy oak pillar and returned fire, providing covering shots. His men laid down a dense barrage of suppressing fire, forcing the asylum guards to take cover. This bought them the crucial seconds they needed. They pushed through the shattered rear doors and plunged into the freezing, pitch-black forest. The sudden blast of cold, unfiltered night air hit Louise like a physical blow. She stumbled in the thick mud, her legs weak from years of forced confinement. Gotha did not let her fall. He practically carried her through the dense underbrush, tearing through thorns and branches as they ran blindly toward the extraction point. The carriage was waiting exactly where they had left it, hidden beneath a canopy of dense pine trees. The horses were wild with panic from the sound of the gunfire, stomping the frozen ground and pulling violently at their reins. Gotha threw Louise into the dark cabin of the carriage and climbed up to the driver's seat. His men scrambled onto the sides, clinging to the wooden frame, as Gotha whipped the horses into a frenzied gallop. The heavy wheels spun in the mud before catching traction, launching the vehicle forward into the night. Behind them, the sanatorium was lit up like a beacon. Men were pouring out of the gates with lanterns and rifles. A bullet struck the wooden frame of the carriage, splintering the wood inches from where Louise sat shivering in the dark. Gotha pushed the horses to their absolute physical limits. They tore down the narrow, winding dirt roads, the carriage bouncing violently over rocks and deep ruts. The speed was terrifying, but slowing down meant certain capture and an immediate return to the medical hell they had just escaped. The initial pursuit lasted for miles. The asylum guards mounted their own horses, chasing the carriage through the treacherous terrain. But Gotha had planned the route meticulously. He took sharp, dangerous turns down unmarked logging trails, using the dense forest to obscure their tracks. The sound of the pursuing hooves gradually faded, replaced entirely by the harsh breathing of their own exhausted horses. They had broken the immediate perimeter, but the real challenge had only just begun. The breakout would trigger the largest international manhunt of the decade. Inside the dark carriage, Louise sat in a state of profound shock. The sensory overload of the violent escape, the freezing wind, and the sheer velocity of their movement was overwhelming after 7 years of silent captivity. She pulled Gotha's heavy coat tightly around her frail body, her hands shaking violently. She was free. The realization was terrifying in its magnitude. She had no money, no identity papers, and no destination. She was a fugitive of the state, a certified lunatic on the run. But she was breathing free air. By dawn, the news of the escape reached the desk of Prince Philip in Vienna. The reaction was volcanic. Philip smashed the furniture in his study, completely consumed by a toxic mixture of rage and humiliation. A disgraced, penniless cavalry officer had managed to infiltrate a high-security state medical facility and steal his wife. Worse, this action threatened Philip's total control over Louise's vast financial assets. He immediately dispatched his private fixers and contacted the highest levels of the Austrian military police. The news also traveled rapidly to King Leopold II in Belgium. The king received the telegram over his morning coffee. His reaction was characteristically cold and entirely devoid of paternal concern. He viewed the escape not as a rescue, but as a massive public relations disaster and a threat to his financial structures. He ordered his diplomats to fully cooperate with the Austrian and German authorities. The entire machinery of two powerful European empires was instantly mobilized to hunt down one frail woman and a disgraced soldier. Borders were immediately locked down. Telegraph wires buzzed with descriptions of the fugitives, Every train station, port, and major thoroughfare was heavily guarded. Bounties were issued offering massive financial rewards for any information leading to their capture. The royal establishments intended to crush this rebellion completely and publicly. They needed to prove that nobody, especially a woman deemed legally insane, could defy the combined power of the aristocracy and the medical establishment. Gotha knew they could not stay on the main roads. As daylight broke, he steered the exhausted horses deep into an abandoned barn on the edge of a rural farming village. They needed to rest, change out of their conspicuous clothing, and wait for the cover of darkness to move again. Inside the damp, freezing barn, Gotha finally had a moment to look at the woman he had just saved. He saw the physical toll the asylum had taken on her. Her hair was matted, her skin was completely devoid of color, and she possessed a haunted, defensive posture. He approached her slowly, kneeling on the dirt floor. He took her trembling hands in his own. There were no grand romantic declarations. The reality of their situation was far too grim for poetry. He simply told her that they would not stop running until they reached a country that would not extradite them. Louise looked into his eyes, seeing the exhaustion and the fierce determination etched into his face. For the first time in 7 years, she felt entirely safe. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder. The journey across Europe was a brutal game of cat and mouse. They traveled exclusively at night, avoiding major cities and train lines. They slept in ditches, abandoned cellars, and dense forests. They survived on stolen vegetables and stale bread purchased by Gotha's men in isolated rural outposts. Every snapping twig or distant dog bark sent a spike of pure adrenaline through their exhausted bodies. The fear of capture was a constant suffocating weight. If they were caught, Gotha would face the firing squad, and Louise would be buried in a darker hole. Gotha utilized every skill he had learned in the military and in prison. He forged transit papers using stolen ink and official stamps acquired through his underground contacts. He bribed border guards with the last remaining coins from his meager savings. They assumed false identities, playing the roles of impoverished merchants fleeing debt. Louise had to completely erase her aristocratic bearing. She learned to keep her head down, to dirty her face, and to walk with the defeated slump of a common laborer. The physical strain nearly broke them both. Louise suffered from severe exposure, battling a relentless fever that racked her body for days. They had to hide in a rat-infested cellar while Gotha frantically searched for black market medicine, terrified that her cough would alert the roaming patrols above. They were hunted animals, pushed entirely to the fringes of society. Yet through the starvation and the freezing rain, their bond only galvanized. The shared suffering stripped away all the superficial layers of their past lives. They eventually reached the border of France. It was heavily fortified, crawling with German military police holding their descriptions. Crossing legally was completely impossible. Gotha paid a ruthless smuggler to hide them in the false bottom of a wagon hauling rotting livestock feed. They lay in total darkness for hours, breathing through small cracks in the wood, suffocated by the stench of decay. The wagon was stopped at the checkpoint. They heard the heavy boots of the guards walking directly above their heads, the sharp commands spoken in German. A bayonet was thrust violently into the pile of feed, the sharp steel blade missing Gotha's face by a fraction of an inch. He held his breath, wrapping his hand tightly around Louise's mouth to prevent her from gasping. The tension was unbearable, stretching out into what felt like hours. Finally, the guards waved the wagon through. They felt the heavy wooden wheels roll over the cobblestone boundary line. They had crossed into French territory. The smuggler drove them several miles inward before dumping them roughly onto the side of a dirt road. They lay in the mud, staring up at the gray sky. They were completely exhausted, starving, and filthy. But the German military police had no jurisdiction here. They had successfully outrun the reach of Prince Philip and King Leopold. They slowly pulled themselves up from the dirt, leaning heavily on each other for support. They began the long, agonizing walk toward Paris. It was the only city large enough to swallow them whole, a place where a disgraced princess and a convicted felon could disappear into the sprawling masses. Arriving in Paris was a severe shock. The city was a booming metropolis of wealth and culture, entirely indifferent to their suffering. They had no money for a hotel, no clean clothes, and no immediate way to secure food. The aristocratic world Louise had once known, the world of grand balls, silk dresses, and endless servants, was completely inaccessible to them. They were thrust violently into the brutal reality of urban poverty. They found shelter in a cramped, unheated attic apartment located in a notorious slum district far away from the grand boulevards. The transition was particularly brutal for Louise. She had gone from a palace to a medical prison to a freezing attic where she had to scrub her own floors and ration stale bread. But she did not complain. She embraced the poverty with a fierce, defiant pride. She spent her days mending Jaza's single torn coat and walking the crowded markets, negotiating fiercely for bruised fruit and cheap cuts of meat. She found a strange, profound dignity in the struggle for survival. She was no longer a victim. She was an active participant in her own life. Jaza worked grueling manual labor jobs, loading heavy cargo at the docks or hauling coal to scrape together rent money. He returned to the small attic every night, his hands blistered and bleeding, his body aching from the severe physical exertion. He would hand her a few meager coins, a silent testament to his devotion. They would sit together on a thin, lumpy mattress, sharing a meager meal by the light of a single candle. In those quiet moments, surrounded by squalor, they possessed a wealth that King Leopold could never comprehend. However, the long shadow of their past refused to completely vanish. Prince Philippe and the Belgian royal family quickly realized they had lost physical control of Louise. They immediately shifted their tactics to financial warfare. They launched a massive, highly publicized legal campaign across Europe to ensure she remained legally dead. They froze every single asset, trust fund, and inheritance tied to her name. They sent aggressively worded legal warnings to banks in Paris, ensuring that anyone who attempted to lend her money would face the wrath of the Belgian crown. They wanted to starve her into submission. Philippe believed that a woman born into extreme luxury would eventually break under the crushing weight of poverty. He assumed she would eventually come crawling back to the Austrian courts, begging for a small allowance in exchange for her freedom and her silence. He severely miscalculated her resolve. The asylum had burned away her fear of discomfort. The freezing Parisian winters and the constant hunger were difficult, but they were infinitely better than the padded cell and the threat of electroshock. They lived entirely off the radar, hiding from debt collectors and private investigators hired by her husband. They changed apartments frequently, moving from one cramped room to another whenever they suspected they were being watched. They lived in a constant state of low-level paranoia, knowing that a single mistake could lead to a kidnapping and a forced return to Saxony. But they faced this anxiety together. They built an impenetrable fortress around their small, impoverished life, finding brief moments of genuine joy in the busy streets of Paris. Louise began to document her experiences. She acquired cheap notebooks and a simple pen, spending hours writing down the details of her abuse, her imprisonment, and the corruption of the royal families. She wrote with a cold, clear precision. She did not seek pity. She sought to expose the monstrous systems that allowed men like her father and her husband to operate with total impunity. Her writings were a direct challenge to the establishment, a permanent record of their crimes against her. She knew that the truth was the only weapon she possessed. As the years dragged on, the physical toll of their traumatic past began to manifest. Jesus' health steadily declined, completely ruined by the brutal years of military prison and the grueling manual labor he performed in Paris to keep them alive. He developed a severe chronic cough and struggled to maintain his strength. Louise became his primary caregiver, tending to him with the same absolute devotion he had shown her in the asylum. The roles were reversed, but the profound bond between them remained entirely unbroken. They faced his failing health with quiet dignity. The Belle Epoque in Paris was a period characterized by unprecedented optimism, economic prosperity, and cultural innovation. The grand boulevards were lined with electric lights, the cafes overflowed with artists and intellectuals, and the aristocracy of Europe flocked to the city to indulge in its legendary luxuries. Yet Princess Louise and Geza Matacic existed entirely outside of this glittering reality. They lived in the shadows of the capital, navigating a parallel world of pawnshops, cramped quarters, and constant financial anxiety. The extreme contrast between the city's overflowing wealth and their daily struggle for basic sustenance was a bitter irony that Louise documented extensively in her private writings. She had been born into a family that measured its wealth in entire nations and continents. Now she measured her resources in the few francs required to purchase coal for a small stove. This drastic transition would have broken a weaker individual, but Louise discovered a profound resilience within herself. The asylum had burned away the fragile, compliant princess she had once been. In her place stood a woman hardened by betrayal and deeply suspicious of the aristocratic systems that had attempted to destroy her. She walked the streets of Paris not as a disgraced royal hiding in shame, but as an exile who had successfully defeated an empire's attempt to erase her existence. Her daily routine was grueling and monotonous. She mended their threadbare clothing, cooked meager meals over a small fire, and cared for Geza as his health continued to falter. The damp, freezing Parisian winters were particularly cruel to his weakened lungs. He had never fully recovered from the physical abuse and malnutrition he endured during his 4 years in an Austrian military prison. The man who had possessed the immense physical strength and tactical brilliance to orchestrate an armed raid on a high-security sanatorium was now frequently bedridden, plagued by chronic respiratory issues and a deep, lingering exhaustion. Watching the man she loved slowly deteriorate was a psychological torture unlike any she had faced in the asylum. The doctors in Saxony had tried to break her mind with threats and isolation, but watching Geza suffer broke her heart in a profoundly different way. She felt a crushing sense of guilt, knowing that his physical ruin was the direct result of his unwavering devotion to her. If he had never met her, he would likely be a celebrated cavalry officer, living comfortably in Vienna. Instead, he was coughing blood in a drafty Parisian attic. When she expressed these feelings of guilt to him, Geza immediately silenced her. He possessed no regrets. He told her clearly and repeatedly that the years they spent together in poverty were infinitely more valuable than a lifetime of comfortable obedience in an Austrian barracks. He viewed his sacrifice not as a tragedy, but as a deliberate, honorable choice. Their bond was completely stripped of the artificial constraints of royal protocol. It was raw, honest, and forged in the fires of mutual survival. They were entirely dependent on each other, finding a profound, quiet dignity in their shared isolation. While they battled daily poverty, a massive geopolitical and financial earthquake was brewing in Belgium. In December 1909, King Leopold II died. The monarch who had ruthlessly exploited the Congo Free State and amassed one of the largest personal fortunes in modern human history took his last breath in a luxurious pavilion, surrounded by his young mistress and a team of frantic lawyers. His death sent immediate shockwaves across Europe. For Louise, it signaled the beginning of a new, highly public war. She was his eldest daughter, and by all traditional laws of inheritance, she was entitled to a massive portion of his estate. However, Leopold was a man who despised the idea of surrendering his wealth, even in death. He had spent the final years of his life constructing a complex, highly secretive financial labyrinth designed explicitly to disinherit his 3 daughters. He possessed a deep, paranoid hatred for the men they had married, particularly Prince Philip, and he was determined to ensure that not a single franc of his Congo fortune fell into their hands. To achieve this, Leopold had utilized the absolute power of the crown to create a series of shell corporations and hidden foundations. The most significant of these entities was the Niederwald Foundation, essentially a massive holding company registered in Germany. Leopold had quietly transferred hundreds of millions of francs in real estate, cash, and colonial assets into this foundation. In his final will, he claimed that his personal estate was relatively modest, leaving his daughters only a fraction of what they were legally owed under the Belgian constitution. He left the vast majority of his hidden empire to the Belgian state and to his young mistress, Caroline Delacroix, completely bypassing his legitimate heirs. The revelation of this financial deception was a masterclass in royal corruption. When the terms of the will were made public, the Belgian populace was stunned by the sheer audacity of the dead king. He had manipulated international law to rob his own children. For Louise, who was struggling to buy food in Paris, the discovery was a deeply personal insult. It was the final devastating proof that her father viewed her not as a human being, but as a financial liability to be neutralized. She realized that she could no longer simply hide in the shadows. She made a decision that shocked the European establishment. Penniless, living in exile, and still legally classified as an escaped lunatic by the Austrian courts, Princess Louise launched a massive lawsuit against the Belgian state. She demanded her rightful inheritance. She hired a team of aggressive, ambitious French and Belgian lawyers who were eager to take on the royal establishment. The lawsuit was not merely about money, it was a desperate, highly public demand for justice and a complete repudiation of the men who had spent their lives trying to control her. The legal battle quickly became the most sensational trial of the decade. The courtrooms in Brussels were packed with journalists, legal scholars, and spectators, eager to witness the airing of the royal family's darkest secrets. Louise's legal team argued forcefully that the Niederwald Foundation was a fraudulent entity created solely to bypass the strict inheritance laws of the Napoleonic Code, which mandated that children receive a guaranteed portion of their parents' estate. They meticulously dismantled Leopold's financial structures, exposing the deep corruption that linked the crown to private corporate interests. The Belgian government fought back with immense ferocity. They had inherited the vast wealth of the Congo, and they were not willing to surrender a single building or bank account to a disgraced princess living in a Parisian slum. The state lawyers utilized every legal loophole and procedural delay to exhaust Louise's limited resources. They attempted to discredit her character, bringing up her past incarceration in the asylum and her ongoing relationship with a convicted felon. They argued that giving millions of francs to a woman with a history of severe psychiatric instability would be a gross mismanagement of national assets. Prince Philippe, watching the chaos from Vienna, also entered the legal fray. He saw an opportunity to finally secure the money he believed he was owed. He aggressively petitioned the courts, arguing that as her legal husband, he was the rightful administrator of any inheritance she might receive. He reiterated his claims that she was dangerously insane and completely incapable of managing her own affairs. He wanted the Belgian courts to hand the millions directly to him, completely bypassing the one who was actually fighting the legal battle. Louise found herself fighting a war on three massive fronts. She was battling the limitless resources of the Belgian government, the vindictive cruelty of her husband in Austria, and the crushing daily poverty of her life in Paris. Yet she refused to back down. She provided countless hours of testimony and documentation to her lawyers. She wrote open letters to the European press, clearly and rationally articulating her case. Her public statements were articulate, sharp, and entirely devoid of the madness her enemies claimed she possessed. Her legal struggle forced the French legal and medical systems to finally address her status. Because Prince Philip was aggressively trying to seize her potential assets in France, the French courts required a definitive ruling on her mental competency. Louise voluntarily submitted to a series of rigorous, independent psychiatric evaluations conducted by leading French medical experts. These were not the corrupt royal physicians of the Lindenhof Asylum. These were respected professionals operating outside the influence of the Austrian and Belgian crowns. The results of these evaluations were a massive, humiliating blow to Prince Philip. The French medical board concluded definitively that Princess Louise was perfectly sane. They found absolutely no evidence of nymphomania, spending mania, or any severe psychiatric disorder. They noted her intelligence, her clear grasp of complex financial matters, and her profound emotional resilience. The French courts officially declared her legally competent, effectively nullifying the corrupt Austrian diagnoses that had kept her imprisoned for 7 years. This was a monumental victory. For the first time in over a decade, she was legally recognized as a sane, autonomous human being in the eyes of a major European nation. The ruling provided her with a powerful layer of legal protection in Paris, preventing Prince Philip from attempting another forced extradition or medical kidnapping. It also heavily bolstered her credibility in the ongoing lawsuit against the Belgian state. The public began to view her not as a madwoman, but as a victim of a massive state-sponsored conspiracy. However, the wheels of justice in the high courts of Brussels turned agonizingly slowly. The lawsuit dragged on for years, bogged down by endless appeals, jurisdictional disputes, and the deliberate stalling tactics of the Belgian government. While her lawyers fought over millions in courtrooms, Louise and Gotha continued to count pennies in their unheated apartment. The legal victory in France had restored her dignity, but it did not pay the rent or buy the expensive medicine Gotha desperately needed. The immense stress of the ongoing legal battle, combined with their severe poverty, accelerated Gotha's physical decline. He spent most of his days confined to a small chair by the window, watching the bustling streets of Paris that he could no longer navigate. He listened as Louise read aloud the legal updates from her attorneys, his mind still sharp even as his body failed him. He offered strategic advice using his military background to analyze the maneuvers of their legal opponents. He remained her fiercest protector and her most trusted confidant. The situation in Paris grew exponentially more dangerous in the summer of 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo ignited the powder keg of European alliances, plunging the continent into the catastrophic violence of the First World War. For Louise and Gotha, the outbreak of global conflict was not just a political crisis, it was an immediate, terrifying threat to their daily survival. The geopolitical lines drawn by the war turned them instantly into enemy aliens within the city they had claimed as their sanctuary. Gotha was legally a subject of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an enemy nation currently at war with France. Louise, though born a Belgian princess, was technically a German citizen through her marriage to Prince Philip of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The Parisian authorities, gripped by severe wartime paranoia and the fear of espionage, immediately clamped down on foreign nationals. The atmosphere in the city turned hostile and highly suspicious. Neighbors who had previously ignored them now viewed them with open distrust. The French government issued strict regulations regarding enemy aliens. Gotha faced the very real threat of being arrested and placed in a civilian internment camp. Given his extremely fragile health, internment would have been a rapid death sentence. Louise used every ounce of the legal credibility she had recently won to protect him. She fiercely petitioned the local police prefectures, presenting the French medical rulings and arguing that they were political exiles, aggressively hunted by the very empires France was currently fighting. They were eventually granted permission to remain in Paris, but their movements were severely restricted. They had to report regularly to the local police station, and their meager resources were stretched even further by the massive wartime inflation and severe food shortages. The city was frequently plunged into darkness to avoid German Zeppelin raids, and the distant rumble of artillery fire could sometimes be heard from the Western Front. They spent the war years huddled in their small apartment, isolated and constantly afraid of being deported or arrested. The war also completely halted the progress of her lawsuit in Belgium. The German army invaded and occupied Brussels, shutting down the civilian courts and seizing control of the state apparatus. All legal proceedings regarding King Leopold's estate were suspended indefinitely. The millions of francs she was fighting for were locked away behind impenetrable military lines. The hope of a sudden financial rescue completely evaporated, leaving them to face the brutal wartime winters with absolutely no safety net. Through the relentless bombardments and the gnawing hunger, their relationship remained the only constant in a world tearing itself apart. Louise cared for Gotha with a fierce, uncompromising dedication as his condition became terminal. She stood in long, freezing ration lines for hours and sold the very last of her personal possessions to buy him medicine on the black market. During these agonizing years, she turned to the only weapon she had left, her unvarnished truth. In 1921, she published a comprehensive autobiography, refusing to hide behind sanitized aristocratic language. She named the corrupt physicians, detailed Philippe's intimate cruelty, and exposed King Leopold's monstrous greed. The memoir proved definitively that she was highly intelligent and entirely sane. Gotha passed away quietly in October 1923, dying a poor, legally disgraced man, but completely free. Following his death, the Belgian courts awarded Louise a negligible fraction of the billions owed, keeping the wealth concentrated within the government. Stripped of legal justice, she relocated to Germany and died on March 1st, 1924, facing her end with the same stoic defiance she had shown the asylum doctors. Her life stands as a chilling indictment of how Victorian psychiatric systems were weaponized by elite men to silence financially inconvenient women. In her final writings, she left a defining judgment on the aristocracy she abandoned. She would rather eat dry bread with Gotha than reign as an empress beside Philippe.